We're going to start here with a stone that has a photo transfer on it, as well as some additional crayon type materials. I point this out because it's important when we're starting on our first etch to know what materials we've used on our stone so that we can plan the strength of our etches. The most basic etch is gum only, and in some instances, gum is enough. But depending on what materials you've used and how heavily you've applied them, you may need to acidify your gum etches with nitric acid. So make note of the materials you've used, set that information aside, and let's prep the stone. Before we can place even a straight gum etch onto our stone, we need to protect it. We do this with powdered rosin and then powdered talc. We start with the rosin, applying a small amount to the center of the stone, and using the brush it around over the entire surface. If there are large areas of your stone that don't contain drawing of any kind, you don't need to apply the rosin there. But generally speaking, you cover all or most of the stone with rosin before removing it and placing it back into the rosin box. I should mention that if you've used any sort of wet drawing materials on your stone, you're going to have to ensure they're fully dry before you get going on the etching process. You don't want to be placing your rosin and your talc into wet touche or autographic ink, for example. So you can see that I'm using my hand to brush the remaining rosin back into the box, and then I'll repeat this step with the talc. It's not the end of the world if you were to forget the rosin or the talc, but it's a pretty important part of this process. The rosin protects the stone, or protects the drawing materials rather, from the harsh acidity that the nitric acid plus gum etches will apply to it. And the talc allows the etch itself, which is a water-based gum arabic etch, to pull as close as possible to the drawing materials, so it kind of reduces surface tension. We keep the rosin, but I tend to throw out the talc, so you can brush it into your hand and place it into the garbage can. So we've made some decisions based on the drawing materials we've used on this stone. We're going to be doing a gum etch, straight gum, as well as a 4-drop etch. So we're going to use a shot glass and fill it 2/3 of the way full with gum arabic. And for the gum only etch, we aren't adding anything to it. It's just gum in the small bowl. In order to make our 4-drop etch, we're going to take a similar amount of gum into the other bowl and then add nitric acid. Nitric acid is no joke. It is the most dangerous material that we use in printmaking, and unfortunately we can't really get around its use in stone lithography. So before you move on to these steps, put on your eye protection and your gloves. Nitric acid comes in this small dropper bottle, and you always add nitric acid to gum arabic. You never ever place nitric acid into an empty bowl first. You are always adding nitric acid to gum. So with a small pinch to pull some of that nitric acid into the dropper, I can then place it over top of my bowl and carefully squeeze out 4 drops. I will then place the dropper back into the bottle, turn the lid tight, and place it aside. If I had more etches to do, I would do them just like that with the appropriate number of drops. Because there is no way to visually tell how strong or how hot an etch is, it's important to keep track. Here's a very simple way to do that. So, next step, go and get some cheesecloth from the rack. You'll probably need 2 or 3 pieces. Squish it around in your hands to make it soft, and then form some small puffs with it. And set them aside at your workstation. Alright, let's get into the fun stuff. So our stone, as you recall, has been rosined and talced, and now I'm going to start with my gum only etch. That is straight gum arabic poured directly onto the surface of the stone. If you've seen me do this demo in person, you'll know that for the first application of gum, I usually pour it onto the stone and then move it around with my hands. It smells nice, it feels good, it's just kind of a very tactile sensation, but tends to make the camera sticky. So for today I'm using a brush, and if you would rather use a brush, you can definitely do so. I'm ensuring that my gum is going everywhere on the stone. I'm moving it around side to side and back and forth. And if this stone had a gum border, as many stones would, you would use this opportunity to allow this fresh gum to dissolve it. Due to the fact that I did a photo transfer on this stone and then some additional drawing, having the gum on there first didn't make sense. In any event, we're about to move on to the etch portion. So I've got gum all over the surface of my stone, the fresh gum, the straight out of the container gum on the surface of the stone. And now with a brush, I begin applying the next lightest etch. Now remember, gum itself is an etch. So the next lightest etch, and really in this case, the only other etch that we're using for this particular stone is a 4-drop etch. I hope you now understand where the drops come from. The drops, or the acidic strength, are measured here colloquially in drops. That is the number of drops coming out of the little dropper of nitric acid. So for this first portion here, we're watching it in real time so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm not applying the 4-drop etch everywhere on the stone. I'm only applying it to the parts of the stone that require it. It gets a little bit dicey as I brush this stronger etch over parts of the stone that do need the stronger etch, where I've drawn with the drawing materials, but are also going over parts of the stone that really only need the straight gum. This is always a bit of a balance. So we've applied the first application of our hotter etch, our stronger etch, and we let it sit on the stone for about 2 minutes. Now, using a dampened gum sponge, we blot up the excess of the etch that we've applied. Had we moved on to an even stronger etch, let's say this stone needed an 8-drop etch and a 12-drop etch, we would continue along just as we've done. We would move on to the next hotter etch and eventually end up with the hottest or the most acidic, the strongest of the etches. We would let them sit and then we would blot them off carefully. The point here is that we don't want to smear the hotter etches around over parts of the stone that could be damaged by them. So after the blotting, we are going to apply the stronger etches. Again, in this case, for this stone, there's only one additional etch, and we place it exactly where we placed it the first time, blotting it up after letting it sit for a couple of minutes, and then repeating a third time. 3 applications of your etches is typically enough. So after finishing with the blotting, we're now ready to buff this gum in tight, as they say. We will start by adding a little more fresh gum to the surface of the stone and rubbing it all over the stone with the sponge. We want to ensure that the stone is uniformly wet with gum before moving on to the buffing stage. So back and forth, and really you can do this as long as you can stand it. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. The longer the stone is in wet gum, the better the chance this stone has of printing cleanly and regularly. Okay, so we're almost ready to move on to the cheesecloth. So using the sponge, I'm going to drag against the stone in a couple of directions, removing as much as I possibly can before the final step. And here is our first cheesecloth puff. Now, I'm also going to drag it across the stone. I tend to go left to right and then top to bottom. If the cheesecloth gets too sticky, I can open it up, find a clean spot on it, and then repeat. For the first few times back and forth on the stone, the cheesecloth will be sticky. There's no doubt about it. But as the gum is thinned out, it becomes less sticky, and eventually it becomes quite smooth and even slick. So at that point, we find a new clean part on our cheesecloth or a new piece of cheesecloth altogether, and then we can begin zipping over the surface of the stone. This is referred to as buffing the stone tight. And there's more than one stone lithographer out in the world who will say that buffing tight is the key to stone lithography. So you spend a couple of minutes, which can feel like an eternity. You're pressing down on the stone with a lot of force. You're breathing hard, but you're almost done. Once you're finished, you can use your damp gum sponge to wipe up any drips along the side of the stone, but be careful at this point not to get your stone wet. As soon as you can, move it to a safe location and put the lid on it. The first etch process is nearly finished. The last things you need to do are clean your cheesecloth with warm water in the sink as well as the gum sponge. Wring them out in warm water, twist them, make sure that they're as clean as you can get them, and then put them back where they belong. The cheesecloth should be stretched out and then snapped to dry it before being hung on the rack. The relatively small amount of gum or acidified gum you have left can go down the drain with plenty of water, and you clean your tools and bowls with warm water as well. Make sure everything you've used is back where it belongs, and then go take a well-deserved break.